All right, so we're now moving on from padding and margins to borders. So looking at how we can give borders to our elements and what different styles we can use. All right, before we do that though, I'm going to give you a quick challenge because everything's getting a little bit complex here. So to make it easier just to work with borders, I'm going to reset everything back to 0. And then I'd like you to create, using just divs, 3 squares, 100 pixels wide and 100 pixels high, and make them red, blue, and green. So 3 squares, 100 pixels by 100 pixels, and red, blue, and green. Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. I'm going to start with the HTML. And all we're going to need here is divs with IDs. I'm going to use IDs because there's only going to be one of each of them. And I'm going to call the first one square dash red. And then another one will be square dash blue. And the third will be, you've guessed it, square dash green. Okay, so obviously if we look at that, there's nothing there because there's no content. But we can add some styling to our divs, which will make them appear. So let's start with square dash red. So the main thing we'll need here is a background color of red. But we'll also need a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. There we go. Wonderful. There's our red square. So let's copy and paste that for our blue and green squares. Now they're going to be exactly the same, except they're of course going to be blue and green. Let's have a look. There we go. So we've solved the problem, but it's not particularly elegant. If I wanted to change the size of all 3 of these squares, as I might want to do, then I'd have to update all of those. Similarly, I don't quite like the fact that they're attached and I'd like to add margins to them, but I'd have to do that separately for all 3, which is not a great way to set up our page because it requires a lot of work to update it. So what I'm going to do is add a class of square to each of these divs. And then I'm going to put anything that's common to all 3 of them into that square styling there. So the main thing that's common to all of them is the width and the height. So I'm going to put that in there, and then I can get rid of it for everywhere else. All right, so let's have a look. Excellent. It's still exactly the same as it was before, but we now have 2 big advantages. One is that we have less code than we had before. Well, probably just about. But the bigger one is that I can now update of these squares with just one CSS styling. So as I mentioned, I'm going to add a little bit of a margin. Let's try 10 pixels just to spread them out a little bit. Yeah, I think that looks better. Maybe even go for something like 40 pixels. Yeah. I'm also going to have them along the top for no particular reason, that I think that looks a little bit nicer. And I can do that really easily by just setting them all to float left. There we go. Brilliant. So I hope you managed that challenge, but also I hope it was useful to see the advantage of using IDs in some cases, but classes in another, to keep your code nice and easily updatable and changeable. All right, so now on to borders. So I'm going to do different borders for each of these boxes. And we'll start off with a nice straightforward one for red, and we'll have a 1 pixel black border. And we do that by setting up a border property, and then we have to specify 3 things. So the width of the border first off, so 1 pixel in this case, then the color of the border, so black in this case, and then the style of the border, and I'm going to use solid. There we go. So you can hopefully just about see that. Let's make it a little bit thicker. So we'll go for 10 pixels. And now you can really see it clearly there. So obviously you can change any of those. We could have a nice yellow border. We can change the width as we already have, and we can change the type as well. And if we want to get a list of the different types we can have, just Google border styles and then click on the top result. And you can see we've got solid, which is the one we've already used. But if you scroll down, then you can see all these different ones here. It's dotted, dashed, double, groove, ridge. So you can try all of these out. Let's have a look at double. There you go. So it sort of goes yellow, then red, then yellow. We can have dashed as well, which creates this dashed effect. And you're welcome to try out the other ones. To be honest, I don't use the different border styles very often. Solid is about all I regularly go for. Okay. Now we can do much more complicated things than that if we want to. So if we want to set, for example, the border to be different, top, left, bottom, and right, we can do that using border and then the various different options. So if we wanted to have a different style on top, left, bottom, and right, I've no idea why we would do that, but we might have border style, and then let's say start off with a ridged one, then a solid, then dotted, and then dashed. And just with margins and padding, this will be the top one, and then right, and then bottom and left. So let's have a look, see what horrendous border we're creating here. So you can see we've got some defaults of black and a certain width. I think that's about 3 pixels. We've got a different style on each one. So here's a challenge for you. Can you create it so that there's a different color on the top, right, bottom, and left as well? Go for it. Did you manage it? It's pretty similar. We just use border color, and then we could have green, and then let's use a few of these example ones. Green, beige, pink, and pale goldenrod. That sounds good. Wonderful. So now we've got different colors. It's looking horrendous, but it's a good example of what we're capable of. And then finally, I'll just set a different width for each one as well. And we'll do that with border width. And we'll have 10 pixels, 5 pixels, 2 pixels, and 1 pixel. And there we go. So it looks pretty horrendous, but it's pretty powerful as well. We can really customize this as much as we want. And just like with margins and paddings, you could set this one by one using, for example, border left color, border left style, etc. All right, so finally look at a much nicer use of borders, and this is a border radius. So rounded rectangles are still all the rage, and they're really easy to create using border radius. So strictly speaking, this isn't really a border at all, but let's have a look. In fact, let's make it a little bit bigger than that. Have a 20 pixels border radius. What that will do, it doesn't actually add a border at all, but it adds a radius to the edge of our square, which, unlike our second example there, and really the first one too, does look quite aesthetically pleasing. So I'd recommend getting border radius into your toolkit as a web developer. Final quick border radius challenge then. Could you change this border radius style so that it creates a circle from this square? And bonus points if you can do it 2 different ways. Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. All we need to do is set the border radius to half of the width of our square. So our square is 100 pixels. So if we set the border radius to 50 pixels, then the border radius effectively goes all the way from the middle of the top to the middle of the right. So we get a lovely circle. The other way to do it would be to set the border radius to 50%. And the advantage of doing it that way is then it will be a circle regardless of the size, because the border radius will always be half of whatever the width of the div is. So if we change the width of all of these, for example, to be 400 pixels, then you can see it stretches out the border radius all the way. And if the height was 400 pixels as well, then we'd get a really nice big circle. So you can use border radius to create circles out of squares. Wonderful. So we're now coming to the end of our CSS section, but we have a couple of videos before our big CSS project where we're going to clone the BBC News website. And those last few videos are going to focus on styling text with CSS.